Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Let the fog press itself against the window glass. Let the gaslight flicker as it will. Tonight, we return to the cobbled streets of London, to a city of long shadows and longer secrets, in the company of the one man who has never once looked at the surface of things and been satisfied with what he found there. Sherlock Holmes. The name alone ought to be enough. And yet tonight, even he is tired. Tired in the way that only a man who has seen too much, solved too much, and slept too little can truly be. Watson will tell you, if you ask him, there were days that autumn when Holmes sat so still by the window that you might have taken him for one of the portraits hanging on the walls of the very case that would soon find its way to his door. A celebrated portrait artist, dead in his locked studio. A final painting left behind, not the noble likeness anyone expected, but a desolate, windswept landscape, shrouded beneath a heavy velvet veil, and hidden somewhere within the brushstrokes of that strange canvas, a secret so old, so dangerous, that someone had already killed once to keep it buried, and would not hesitate to kill again. Blackmail, high society, a family name built on a lie, and a portrait, the real one, hidden where no one thought to look, holding the face of a truth that could undo everything. If you enjoy mysteries that cut deeper than the surface, stories that remind us how much we conceal behind beauty, behind art, behind the careful masks we show the world, then stay with us tonight. This one does not disappoint. And now, let the story begin. The fog carries bad news. It was the kind of morning that London does particularly well. Grey, damp, and utterly without mercy. The fog had come in thick off the Thames some time before dawn, and had settled over the city like a man who has overstayed his welcome and knows it, yet refuses to move all the same. By 8:30, you could not see the far side of Baker Street from the window. The lamp posts stood in the murk like pale ghosts of themselves, their light swallowed before it could reach the pavement below. I'd been awake since 7. Holmes had not slept at all. I knew this not because he told me, Holmes rarely volunteered such admissions, but because when I came down the stairs that morning, still buttoning my cuff, I found him exactly where I had left him the night before. He was in his armchair by the cold fireplace. He legs drawn up, his mouse-coloured dressing gown wrapped around him like the robes of some gaunt and secular monk. His eyes were open. That was the only concession he made to wakefulness. They were fixed on some point beyond the window, beyond the fog, beyond Baker Street entirely. Fixed on something that existed only in the strange and restless country of his own mind. The fire had gone out hours ago. The room was cold. You might have called for Mrs. Hudson to lay the fire, I said, moving toward the grate myself. I did not notice the cold, he said. His voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man returning from a very great distance. That, I told him, striking a match, is precisely what concerns me. He said nothing to that. I'd not expected him to. This was the third such morning in a fortnight, and the case of the Whitmore letters had concluded 10 days prior. Concluded neatly, as Holmes's cases almost always did, with the right man identified, the evidence secured, and Lestrade accepting the credit with his usual graceless efficiency. But the resolution of a case, I had long since learned, did not restore Holmes in the way that ordinary rest restores ordinary men. If anything, the silence that followed a closed investigation seemed to hollow him out further. He needed the work not merely to occupy himself, but in some deeper and more essential way. The way a furnace needs coal, not for comfort, but simply to remain a furnace at all. Without it, he grew quieter, stiller, and that stillness, I confess, always unsettled me more than any of his more dramatic eccentricities. I set the kettle on and said nothing further. There are mornings when the kindest thing one can offer Sherlock Holmes is the simple courtesy of silence. It was 20 minutes past 9 when we heard the knock at the street door below. 3 sharp raps, efficient and impatient. The knock of a man who has somewhere to be and considers the act of knocking a regrettable interruption to the business of getting there. I heard Mrs. Hudson's voice in the hall, low and brief, and then the tread of boots on the stairs, heavy, flat-footed, familiar. Holmes's eyes shifted from the window to the door. Something moved in them. Not quite interest, not yet, but the first faint suggestion of it. Inspector Lestrade came in without waiting to be invited, which was his custom, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his expression arranged in the particular configuration it wore when he had a problem he could not solve and had come, without quite admitting it, to ask for help. I'd seen that expression a great many times over the years. I'd grown rather fond of it. "Mr. Holmes," he said, then with a nod in my direction, "Doctor." "Lestrade," Holmes said, "sit down. You have been out since before 6, you have not yet breakfasted, and whatever it is you have come to tell me, you have been rehearsing it in the cab on the way over. So, say it plainly, and do not rehearse it any further." Lestrade blinked, looked at me. I gave him the small shrug that means, yes, he does this, and no, there is nothing to be done about it. The inspector sat. "Edmund Hargrove," he said. "You'll know the name." "Portrait painter," Holmes said at once. "Kensington. Fashionable. His likeness of the Duchess of Albemarle hung in the Royal Academy 3 years running. He charged more for a sitting than most men earn in 6 months. And his waiting list ran to 18 months at last count. He was also," Holmes added, with a slight pause that I recognised as deliberate, "not a particularly honest man. Continue." Lestrade stared at him for a moment. "He's dead." The room was quiet. Outside, a cart horse clattered slowly past on the wet cobblestones, and then the fog swallowed the sound. "When?" Holmes asked. "Sometime last night. His housekeeper found him this morning when he didn't come down for breakfast. Our studio door was locked from the inside. She had to fetch the boy from the mews to put his shoulder to it." Lestrade turned his hat in his hands. "It's not a clean scene, Mr. Holmes. There's been violence, but there's something else. Something in the studio that I can't make heads or tails of, and I'll be straight with you. Neither can any of my men." Holmes had not moved from his chair, but something had changed in the quality of his stillness. It was no longer the stillness of absence. It was the stillness of attention, of a mind that has found at last a thread worth pulling. "This something," Holmes said, "does it involve a painting?" Lestrade's head came up sharply. "How in God's name could you know that?" "I don't know it," Holmes said, rising from the chair in a single unhurried motion. "I supposed it. Which is an entirely different thing." He reached for his coat from the hook by the door, then paused and looked back at me. There was something in his expression that I had not seen in it for some weeks. A sharpness, a focus, the particular light that came into his grey eyes when the world had finally offered him something worth his attention. "Come along, Watson," he said. "Bring your bag." I was already reaching for it. Lestrade had a cab waiting below. We rode through the fog in a silence that was, for once, comfortable rather than heavy. Holmes at the window, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his gaze inward. Lestrade across from him, sensibly asking nothing, and I between them, watching my friend and feeling for the first time in a fortnight something very close to relief. He was not restored, not yet. The weariness still sat in the lines around his eyes and the particular set of his jaw, but he was present again, in the way that mattered, present and pulling towards something, like a compass needle finding north. The cab moved through the grey London morning, deeper into Kensington, toward the studio of a dead man, and whatever strange and dangerous thing waited for us behind its locked door. I found, to my own mild surprise, that I could hardly wait to see it. The Studio of Secrets. Hargrove's studio occupied the entire upper floor of a narrow Georgian townhouse on Melbury Road, in that quiet, well-kept corner of Kensington, where artists and architects had long ago established themselves among the older money without quite being accepted by it. The street was respectable without being grand, the sort of street that keeps its curtains clean and its opinions private. This morning, however, the curtains on either side of number 41 were twitching with considerable interest. A police constable stood at the front door. 2 more were visible through the iron railings of the small front garden. Neighbours had gathered in 1s and 2s on the pavement opposite, collars turned up against the damp, pretending to have business there. Death, I have observed, is the one event that reliably overcomes the English instinct for minding one's own affairs. Lestrade led us through the front door and up 2 flights of stairs. The house smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, and beneath those something older and more domestic. Coal smoke, boiled wool, the accumulated warmth of a well-kept home. It was a smell that made the violence waiting at the top of the stairs feel all the more wrong, all the more out of place, like a scream in a library. The studio door stood open. The lock mechanism, I noted as we passed through, had been thrown with considerable force. The bolt was bent, the frame splintered where the wood had given way. Whatever had been locked in there last night had been locked in with serious intent. We stepped inside. I've been in a great many rooms in my life that have seen bad things. I was an army surgeon. I've stood in field hospitals and operating tents and the aftermath of things I do not care to set down in detail. But there is a particular quality to a room in which a man has been killed. Not the gore of it, not the physical fact of the violence, but something subtler and more persistent, a quality of wrongness that the room itself seems to have absorbed and not yet released. Hargrove's studio had that quality in abundance. It was a large room. The ceiling had been raised at some point to accommodate 2 north-facing skylights, and even on this grey and foggy morning, they admitted a cold, even unflattering light. The light that painters prize precisely because it lies about nothing. The walls were hung with canvases in various states of completion, society portraits in gilded frames, preliminary sketches pinned without ceremony over earlier sketches, a study of hands repeated a dozen times at different angles. Brushes stood in tall glass jars like strange dried flowers. Palettes lay stacked against the skirting board, and each one a history of colour, ochre and umber, and the particular blue that Hargrove had apparently favoured for the shadows in his backgrounds. In the centre of the room, an easel had been overturned. It lay at a diagonal across the floorboards, one leg snapped clean off. Around it, the evidence of struggle, a palette knife bent at an ugly angle, a jar of linseed oil shattered against the wainscoting, a dark stain spreading outward from the broken glass that was oil and not blood, though it was not difficult to see how one might mistake the two in poor light. The blood was elsewhere. Edmund Hargrove lay on his back near the far wall, one arm extended as though he had been reaching for something. The door, perhaps, or simply the floor in that last involuntary gesture of a man whose body has not yet accepted what his mind already knows. He was perhaps 60, heavy-set, with the broad hands of a man who had worked with them all his life, the knuckles enlarged, the fingers permanently stained at the tips with pigment that no amount of turpentine had ever quite removed. He was wearing evening dress beneath a paint-spattered working smock. He had been painting late then, or had dressed for an engagement he never kept. I knelt beside him and made my examination, as I have done so many times, and found what I expected and did not expect, and rose again and gave Holmes my preliminary conclusions in the quiet, economical language we had developed for these moments. Blunt force, a single significant blow to the back of the skull, death likely within minutes, time consistent with some time between 10 o'clock and midnight. Holmes listened without interrupting, which meant he had already formed his own conclusions and was checking them against mine. He had been moving through the room while I worked, not hurriedly. Holmes never hurried in a crime scene, any more than a scholar hurries in an archive. He moved with a kind of slow, deliberate attention, crouching here, rising there, his eyes sweeping surfaces in a way that always made me think of a man reading a text, in a language that no one else in the room could see. He examined the overturned easel. He studied the window latches, both locked from within, both undisturbed. He spent a long moment on his knees beside the shattered oil jar, his face very close to the floor, looking at something in the grain of the wood that was invisible to everyone else in the room. Lestrade stood near the door with his arms folded and the expression of a man exercising considerable patience. The door was locked from the inside, Lestrade said, when Holmes rose from the floor. Both windows latched, no other way in or out. The housekeeper's room is directly below, and she heard nothing after 10:30. She heard nothing, Holmes repeated, in a tone that made it a question without inflecting it as one. Nothing she could identify, Lestrade amended, with the slight discomfort of a man who has been anticipated. She said she thought she heard voices at some point. She could not say how many. She could not say whether they were raised or not. She took a sleeping draught at 10. She suffers from insomnia, apparently. And after that, nothing. Holmes nodded slowly, filing this away. Then he turned. And for the first time since we had entered the room, his attention moved to the corner. It was in the far left corner of the studio, positioned against the wall as though placed there deliberately, set apart from the other canvases with a kind of careful intentionality that was distinct from the organised disorder of the rest of the room. A large canvas, perhaps 4 feet by 3, mounted on its own small auxiliary easel, standing very straight and very still. It was covered entirely by a length of heavy velvet, deep green, almost black in the cold studio light. The fabric had been draped with some care, not thrown over hastily, but arranged, smoothed, the edges tucked. Someone had covered this canvas the way you cover something you intend to return to, or the way you cover something you intend never to look at again. And no one had touched it. I could see from the way Lestrade's men positioned themselves in the room that they had all, by some unspoken consensus, been giving it a wide berth. There is a particular quality to an object that has been deliberately concealed. It generates a kind of gravity, a reluctance in the people around it that is not quite superstition and not quite reason, but something uncomfortably between the two. Holmes crossed the room to it. He stood before the veiled canvas for a moment without touching it, simply looking at it, at the shape of it beneath the fabric, at the way the velvet fell. Then he reached out and, with one smooth motion, drew the cloth away. The painting beneath was not what any of us expected. It was not a portrait, it was a landscape, wide, desolate, storm-racked. A flat and featureless plain stretched to a horizon of bruised and swollen clouds. The sky occupied more than half the canvas, a churning mass of grey and ochre and an ugly, sickly green that made the stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. In the far distance, barely visible through what appeared to be driving rain rendered in thin diagonal strokes of grey-white, the suggestion of a structure, a house perhaps, or a ruin, crouched at the edge of the plain like something trying not to be seen. The paint was thick in places, applied with a palette knife as well as brushes, and the texture of it gave the clouds a physical weight, a heaviness that seemed almost to press down out of the frame. It was not technically without skill, but it was utterly unlike everything else in the room. Where the portraits on the walls were smooth, assured, flattering, the work of a man who knew exactly what his clients wanted and was expert at providing it, this landscape was raw and violent and private in a way that felt almost indecent to look at. It was also not quite finished, and it was not, I gradually understood as I stood there looking at it, simply a landscape. Holmes had taken his glass from his coat pocket and was moving it slowly across the surface of the canvas, beginning at the lower left corner and working methodically toward the right. I watched his face. It told me nothing, which told me everything. He had found something, and he was not yet ready to share it. "Holmes," I said quietly. "A moment, Watson." I waited. Lestrade, to his credit, waited also. It was perhaps 2 full minutes before Holmes lowered the glass and straightened. He stood looking at the painting for a moment longer, his expression entirely still. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Good God." "What is it?" Lestrade demanded. "What do you see?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He took one step back from the canvas, then another, as though adjusting his distance to take in the whole. Then he turned to look at us, and there was something in his expression that I had seen only rarely in all the years I had known him. Not excitement, not triumph, but something quieter and more serious than either. Something that looked, if I am honest, rather like the first recognition of danger. "The painting is a blind," he said, "a decoy, and a very clever one. Hargrove painted this deliberately to be found, to be looked at, to occupy the attention of whoever came into this room after his death." He paused. "Look at the clouds, the lower right quadrant, the darkest mass, where the paint is thickest." We looked. I saw nothing but paint and storm. "Now stand back," Holmes said. "Further. Good. Now look again." I looked again. And slowly, the way shapes resolve themselves from shadow when your eyes have adjusted to the dark, I began to see it. In the texture of the thickest paint, in the deliberate architecture of the brushstrokes, worked into the very substance of the storm clouds themselves, with extraordinary patience and craft. Figures, faces, partial, fragmentary, deniable if you were looking for landscape and not for portraiture, but unmistakably there. 2 figures, close together, one seated, one standing, and between them, they are held in the seated figure's hand, what appeared to be a document of some kind. "He hid them in the painting," I said. "He encoded them," Holmes corrected, with the precision that mattered to him always. Which is not quite the same thing. This was not done quickly or carelessly. This took time and skill and a very specific intention. He looked at the canvas once more. Edmund Hargrove knew he was in danger. He knew someone might come for him, and before they did, he left us a message, hidden where only a careful eye would think to look for it. He turned from the painting. "The question," Holmes said, picking up the velvet from the floor where it had fallen, running it thoughtfully through his fingers, "is not who killed Edmund Hargrove. That, I suspect, will prove straightforward enough, ere once we have pulled the right thread." He set the velvet down on a nearby table. "The question is what Edmund Hargrove knew, and who precisely could not afford for him to go on knowing it." The studio was very quiet. Outside, the fog pressed against the skylights. Holmes reached for his coat. "We shall begin," he said, "with the ledger. The name behind the canvas." The ledger was found in the lower drawer of Hargrove's writing desk, a wide, flat-topped affair of dark walnut that occupied the wall opposite the veiled canvas, half buried beneath invoices, correspondence, and the kind of administrative accumulation that gathers around a successful man like sediment around a river stone. The desk itself told a story if you knew how to read it. The surface was immaculate at the centre, where Hargrove had worked, and chaotic at the edges, eyes where he had pushed everything he did not wish to deal with. A man of selective order. The kind of man who kept his important things very tidy and everything else not tidy at all. Holmes went through the drawers with the systematic efficiency of a man who has searched a great many desks and has long since ceased to be distracted by what he is not looking for. The ledger emerged from beneath a folded map and 2 unopened letters, a slim volume bound in brown calfskin, the spine worn smooth with handling. He set it on the cleared centre of the desk and opened it. I stood at his shoulder. Lestrade stood at mine. The 3 of us bent over the pages in the cold studio light, and Holmes turned them slowly, his eyes moving down each column with that particular quality of attention that was less like reading and more like listening, as though the numbers and names on the page were saying something beneath what they appeared to say, and he was simply waiting for the frequency to resolve itself into language. The ledger was, on the surface, a record of commissions, dates, names, agreed fees, deposits received, balances outstanding. Hargrove had been meticulous in his record-keeping, every client listed in a precise, careful hand, every transaction noted with the thoroughness of a man who trusted no one's memory, including his own. The names were, without exception, names of consequence, lords and ladies, a cabinet minister, 2 industrialists whose fortunes had purchased them the social adjacency that birth had not provided, a duchess, a retired general whose portrait, Holmes noted without looking up, currently hung in the Reform Club. He did not want for clients, Lestrade observed. He did not want for leverage either, Holmes said quietly, which caused Lestrade to look at him sharply and me to look at the ledger more carefully. Holmes was right, though it took me a moment to see it. The fees were not consistent. For clients of roughly equivalent social standing, comparable titles, comparable wealth, comparable public profiles, the sums varied enormously. Some had paid what seemed a fair price for the work. Others had paid 2, 3, sometimes 4 times what the work ought to have commanded, even from an artist of Hargrove's reputation. And these higher payments were not marked as anything other than commission fees. No notation, no explanation. Simply the number recorded in that same precise hand, as though there were nothing unusual about a baronet paying 600 guineas for a portrait that his near equal had obtained for 140. He was charging some of them a great deal more than others, I said. He was charging some of them for a great deal more than a painting, Holmes said. He turned the pages more slowly now, moving toward the back of the ledger, toward the most recent entries. And here, near the final pages, something changed. The entries became sparse. The careful, consistent handwriting grew slightly less regular, not dramatically, not in a way you would notice if you were not looking for it, but enough. The pressure of the pen varied. One entry had been begun and then abandoned mid-word, a faint scratch of ink ending abruptly, and as though the writer had been interrupted or had thought better of what he was writing. And on the second-to-last page, near the bottom, there was an entry that was unlike any other in the ledger. A name, or rather, the beginning of one. The first 4 letters, M-E-R-C, written in the normal hand, followed by a dense, heavy scribble of ink that obscured whatever came after. Not a mistake corrected with a single neat line, as Hargrove had done elsewhere when he erred. This was a deliberate obliteration. Someone had pressed hard with a pen and moved it back and forth until the name beneath was irrecoverable. Beside it, where the commission fee would normally appear, there was nothing. The space was blank. Holmes looked at those 4 letters for a very long time. M-E-R-C, Lestrade said, reading over his shoulder. Could be a dozen names. It could, Holmes agreed. He closed the ledger with a soft, definitive sound. But it isn't. We left the studio to Lestrade's men and took a cab back toward the centre of the city. Holmes sat with the ledger on his knee. Lestrade had permitted him to take it, with the agreement that it would be returned before the inquest, and said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes of the journey. I watched the fog slide past the windows and waited, which is a skill I had spent many years acquiring and have never quite perfected. "Mercer," Holmes said at last, without preamble. "You're certain?" The Mercer family is the only family of sufficient standing in Hargrove's established client circle, whose name begins with those 4 letters, and who do not already appear elsewhere in this ledger under their full name. He tapped the cover of the book with one finger. Lord Ashford Mercer. Old money, genuinely old, not the purchased variety. The family seat is in Wiltshire, but they keep a house in Eaton Square. Lord Mercer himself is in his 70s now, largely retired from public life. His elder son, Viscount Hadley Mercer, manages the estate. His younger son, Dorian Mercer, is rather more visible, sits on 2 company boards, attends the right clubs, appears at the right functions. Holmes paused. The family has an exceptionally clean public reputation. No scandal on record, no breath of it in fact. Which, in a family of that age and that wealth, is itself somewhat remarkable. You think Hargrove was blackmailing them? I think Hargrove was blackmailing someone in that family, Holmes said, with the precision he always brought to the distinction between what he knew and what he supposed. The obliterated entry suggests the relationship was of a different character than his other client arrangements, either because he thought better of recording it in full, or because someone else got to the ledger before we did and removed what they could. He looked out of the window. The blank fee column is the more interesting detail. It means either that no money had yet changed hands, that they were in negotiation, as it were, or that the payment was made by other means. What other means? Holmes smiled faintly without humour. That is what we need to find out. It was late afternoon by the time we had exhausted the immediate resources of Holmes's index and the rather more extensive resources of his memory, and had assembled what could be assembled about the Mercer family from the materials available to us at Baker Street. Holmes sat at his desk surrounded by newspaper clippings, 2 volumes of Burke's Peerage, a social directory, and the accumulated correspondence of what appeared to be several years' worth of filed intelligence on families of consequence, a private archive that I had always known existed and had never quite got used to. What emerged was a portrait of a family that was, on its surface, exactly what it appeared to be. Old, wealthy, respectable, a record of military service, charitable contribution, and careful political neutrality stretching back 3 generations. Lord Ashford Mercer had married well, produced 2 sons, managed his estate without scandal or debt, and had by all accounts lived a life of such unimpeachable propriety that it had become, in certain circles, faintly boring. And yet, there is a gap, Holmes said, sitting back in his chair and pressing his fingertips together. In the family history, a period of approximately 2 years, in the early 1870s, during which Lord Mercer, then a young man in his mid-20s, is largely absent from the social record. No club appearances, no public engagements. His name does not appear in the announcements of any of the events he would ordinarily have attended. He resurfaces in 1874, apparently unchanged, and resumes his life as though the gap had not occurred. People travel, I said. People fall ill. People do, Holmes agreed. But when they do, they generally leave some trace. A letter of apology for an absent engagement, a notice in the papers of their recovery. The gap in Lord Mercer's record is not the gap of illness or travel. It is the gap of deliberate withdrawal. He paused. And it coincides, within a matter of months, with the birth of a child who is registered under the surname of a minor landed family in Shropshire, and who subsequently disappears from any accessible record entirely. The room was quiet for a moment. You think there is an illegitimate heir, I said. I think there may be, Holmes said carefully. I think Edmund Hargrove thought so too, and I think he had evidence of it, evidence substantial enough to make the Mercer family pay, and pay well, for his continued silence. He rose from the desk and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening street. What I do not yet know is what form that evidence took, where it is now, or which member of the Mercer family decided that silence in the end was better purchased with a blunt instrument than with money. He turned from the window. What I do know, he added, is that we are not the only people looking. I looked at him. What do you mean? The housekeeper, Holmes said. When Lestrade mentioned her this morning, that she had heard voices but could not identify them, I noticed something he had not. There were 2 sets of muddy boot prints in the hallway outside the studio door, and one set belonged to the constable who first attended the scene. The other set was older, made before the rain began last evening, which places them between 6 and 8 o'clock, and they were made by a woman's boot. He paused. A narrow heel, a small foot, and she came and she went, and she did not knock at the front door because the housekeeper did not mention any visitor. She had a key, I said. She had a key, Holmes confirmed, and she came, I suspect, not to see Hargrove, but to look for something he possessed. Whether she found it before his killer arrived, or whether she arrived after the killing and found the studio already as we found it this morning. Holmes spread his hands. That I cannot yet say. He reached for his coat. But I intend, he said, to ask her. The lady in the veil, Holmes, did not go to the Mercer house in Eaton Square that evening. I had expected him to, expected the familiar urgency that overtook him in the middle stages of a case, that forward momentum that made him difficult to keep pace with and impossible to redirect. But he did not go. Instead, he came back to Baker Street, ate something that Mrs. Hudson brought up without being asked, and sat by the fire, which was properly lit this time, and was quiet in a way that was different from the hollow quiet of the preceding weeks. This was the quiet of a man thinking. It had a texture to it, a density, that the other kind did not. I read, he thought. The fire burned down and was replenished. Somewhere around 10 o'clock he rose without explanation, went to his room, and did not come out again that night. He slept, in other words. It was the first time in several days. I noted it in my journal and felt something that was not quite relief, but was closely adjacent to it. By morning, he had a plan. He did not share it with me in detail, which was characteristic. What he shared was its outline. We would not go to the Mercers directly, because to go directly was to give them time to prepare, to align their stories, to present the smooth and impenetrable surface that old families present when they feel themselves under examination. Instead, Holmes had sent a note, through a channel he did not specify and I had learned not to inquire about, to a particular address in Knightsbridge. The note was brief. The reply, which arrived before 9, was briefer still. 3 words, in a handwriting I did not recognize on paper of considerable quality. This afternoon, 2 o'clock. Who is she? I asked. Someone, Holmes said, folding the note and placing it in his breast pocket, who came to a dead man's studio with a key and left without what she came for, which means she is frightened, and which means she may be willing to talk. He picked up his coffee cup. Frightened people, Watson, are frequently the most useful people of all, provided one gives them a reason to believe that talking is safer than silence. The address in Knightsbridge turned out to be a small, well-appointed house on a quiet street that had the particular character of a place maintained at some expense but lived in very privately. No servants visible at the windows, no callers at the door. Yes, the kind of house that a woman of means maintains when she wishes to have somewhere that is entirely her own, separate from the larger household, separate from the obligations and the watching eyes that come with a prominent family name. Holmes knocked at precisely 2 o'clock. The woman who admitted us was not a servant. She opened the door herself, which told me a great deal before she had said a word. That she had sent the servants away for the afternoon, that she had not wanted this meeting witnessed, and that she was, whatever else she might be, a woman who was accustomed to managing difficult situations on her own terms. She was perhaps 35, dark-haired, pale-complexioned, with the kind of composed and careful beauty that looks less like a gift than an achievement, maintained, I thought, at some personal cost. She was dressed simply for a woman of her evident station, in a dark grey that was not quite mourning but leaned in that direction. Her eyes, when they met mine, were steady. When they moved to Holmes, they were something else, measuring, guarded, carrying the look of a person who has decided to do something difficult and is still, even now, debating whether to go through with it. "Mr. Holmes," she said, not a greeting precisely, more an acknowledgement of who he was, of what his presence meant, of the fact that this conversation, once begun, could not be unbegun. "Lady Cecilia," Holmes said, "thank you for seeing us." She stepped back from the door and admitted us into a small sitting room at the front of the house. It was a comfortable room, lived in and personal in a way that the public rooms of large houses never quite manage. Books with broken spines, a half-finished piece of needlework on the arm of a chair, a vase of flowers that had been chosen for their scent rather than their arrangement. She did not offer tea. She sat in the chair opposite us, folded her hands in her lap with a precision that I recognized as a discipline rather than a habit, and looked at Holmes with those measuring eyes. "You found the boot prints," she said. "I found the boot prints," Holmes confirmed. A small silence. Then she said, "I did not kill him." "I know you did not," Holmes said. "If you had killed him, you would not have answered my note. You would have disappeared, left the city, or at least left the house in Knightsbridge, which I suspect very few people know about." He paused. "You came to Hargrove's studio on the evening of his death. You let yourself in with a key he had given you. You went to find something. You did not find it. And then, whether before the killing or after it, that is what I cannot yet determine, you left." Lady Cecilia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me, briefly, as though seeking something in a face that was less formidable. I tried to look trustworthy, which is the nearest I can generally come to being actually useful in these moments. "After," she said quietly. I arrived after. The door to the studio was ajar. I thought at first that he had simply forgotten to close it. Edmund was not always careful about such things. She paused. "I went in. I saw him. She stopped, composed herself with a visible effort. "I did not call for help. I know how that sounds. But if I had called for help, I would have had to explain what I was doing there. And I could not." She stopped again. "You could not explain it without explaining the rest," Holmes said gently. She looked at him with something that might, under different circumstances, have been gratitude. "No?" she said. "I could not." Holmes leaned forward slightly in his chair. "Lady Cecilia, I'm going to ask you to tell me something that you have told no one, and I'm going to ask you to trust that what you tell me will be used only in the service of finding the man who killed Edmund Hargrove, and of protecting you and the people connected to you as far as that is possible." He paused. "I cannot promise you that what comes out of this investigation will be painless. I can promise you that it will be the truth, and that the truth, in my experience, is generally less destructive than the alternative." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a carriage passed slowly along the street, and the sound of it faded, and then there was only the soft tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, and the distant murmur of the city beyond the windows. "Edmund Hargrove," she said at last, "has been blackmailing my family for 11 years. She told it carefully, in the measured way of someone who has been over the story many times in private, and has learned to keep the emotion of it separate from the facts. I listened, and did not interrupt. Holmes listened and was very still, in the way he was still when he was receiving something important, and did not wish to disturb its arrival. The story, stripped to its essentials, was this. Lord Ashford Mercer, her father-in-law, the patriarch of the family, had, in the early years of his young manhood, formed an attachment, not an unusual thing in itself. Young men of his class and era frequently formed attachments that could not be made public, and the machinery of that world was well practiced at managing the consequences discreetly. But Lord Mercer's attachment had produced a child, a son, and Lord Mercer, for reasons that Lady Cecilia said she had never fully understood, reasons she suspected had more to do with genuine feeling than with duty, had not been willing to simply pay the mother and walk away. He had made arrangements. The child had been placed with a respectable family in Shropshire. The family name was Ashworth, she said. And I saw Holmes's expression flicker with the faint satisfaction of a man who has just had a supposition confirmed. And Lord Mercer had, over the years, quietly and through intermediaries, maintained a connection. The child was now a man. He was alive. He was, Lady Cecilia said, entirely unaware of his parentage. He had lived his entire life as Thomas Ashworth of Shropshire, had made something of himself in the world of commerce, and had no idea that the blood in his veins made him, by any honest accounting, the eldest son of one of the oldest families in England. And Hargrove knew all of this, Holmes said. Hargrove knew all of this, she confirmed. I do not know how he came by the knowledge originally. My husband believes that one of Lord Mercer's former solicitors may have talked. The man died some years ago. And we cannot trace it with any certainty. But Hargrove knew, and he had documentation, a letter in Lord Mercer's own hand, written to the child's mother, that made the relationship and his intentions unmistakably clear. She paused. He also had the portrait. Holmes was very still. Tell me about the portrait. Some years ago, 8, perhaps 9, Lord Mercer made what I believe he intended as a private act of acknowledgement. He commissioned Hargrove to paint the boy, Thomas Ashworth. As he was then, a young man of perhaps 20, 21, Hargrove painted him. She folded her hands tighter in her lap. And in that portrait, if you knew what you were looking at, the resemblance to the Mercer family is unmistakable. The same jaw, the same eyes. The same particular set of the brow that you see in the family portraits going back 200 years. She paused. Lord Mercer paid for the portrait. He was permitted to keep it for 1 year. Then Hargrove took it back, and after that, it became the primary instrument of the blackmail. He held the portrait, Holmes said slowly, as proof. As proof, she said, and as threat. As long as Hargrove held the portrait and the letter, the family paid. They have been paying for 11 years, not always in money, sometimes in introductions, in access, in the quiet application of the Mercer influence in places where Hargrove wanted a door opened. Her voice was controlled, but the control cost her something. I could see it in the line of her jaw, the careful stillness of her hands. My husband believed it would never end, that Hargrove would simply go on taking, for as long as Lord Mercer lived, and perhaps beyond. But someone decided it would end, Holmes said. She looked at him. Yes. And you came to the studio that evening to retrieve the portrait and the letter, before anyone else could find them. I came to try, she said. I had a key because Hargrove... She hesitated. Hargrove had, at various points, attempted to use me as an additional means of pressure on the family. He would send for me, ostensibly for sittings. He painted my portrait twice, which gave him reason enough, and used those meetings to make his demands. The key was given to me so that I could come and go without being seen by his housekeeper. The distaste in her voice was quiet but absolute. I went that evening because I had received word from a source within the house that Hargrove had told someone the portrait was about to change hands, that he had found a buyer. I did not know what that meant exactly, but I understood that if the portrait left Hargrove's possession and entered someone else's, our ability to contain the situation would be gone entirely. She looked down at her folded hands. When I arrived, he was already dead. The studio had been searched. I could see that immediately. Drawers opened, things moved. But the velvet canvas was still in the corner, untouched. Whoever killed him and searched the room had looked for the portrait and had not found it. She raised her eyes, and neither did I. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The fire in the small grate shifted and settled. Because the portrait was never in the studio, Holmes said. She looked at him sharply. Hargrove hid it, Holmes said. He hid it somewhere outside the studio, outside this house, outside London, somewhere he considered safe enough that even if the worst happened and someone came for him, the portrait would remain beyond reach. He rose from his chair. The landscape painting in the studio, the painting under the veil, it was not simply a decoy. It was a map of a kind, a communication, left by a man who knew he was running out of time and wanted to ensure that what he knew did not die with him. He looked at Lady Cecilia. I need to ask you one more question. She waited. Did Hargrove ever mention a property outside London? A cottage? A house? Or any place he spoke of with particular familiarity or particular care? Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, more the expression of a person who has just understood, a moment too late, the significance of something they had not thought significant. He had a cottage, she said slowly. In Surrey. He spoke of it occasionally. He called it his thinking place. Somewhere he went when he needed to work without interruption. She paused. I never gave it much thought. It seemed simply the sort of retreat an artist might keep. It is, Holmes said, reaching for his coat. A great deal more than that. He turned to Lady Cecilia, and something in his expression softened, fractionally, the particular softening that he permitted himself when speaking to someone who was, whatever else they might be, genuinely frightened and genuinely in danger. You have been very helpful, he said. I would ask you to remain in this house for the time being and to admit no one you do not know absolutely. What began as blackmail has already become murder. The person responsible has not yet secured what they came for. That makes the situation more dangerous, not less. And it makes you, as someone who knows as much as you know, a person they would very much prefer not to be talking to a consulting detective. She received this without flinching. She was, I thought, a remarkable woman. Find the portrait, Mr. Holmes, she said quietly. I intend to, he said, and I intend to find rather more than that. The hidden portrait. We took the first suitable train from Waterloo the following morning. Holmes had spent the previous evening in what I can only describe as controlled urgency, not the frenetic, pacing energy that sometimes overtook him in the later stages of a case, but something quieter and more purposeful, a man tightening the last few bolts before a long journey. He sent 2 telegrams that he did not show me. He consulted his maps of Surrey with the focused attention of a general studying ground he is about to cross. He ate a proper dinner, which I noted with quiet satisfaction, and was in bed before midnight. I was less settled. I lay awake for some time, turning the case over in the way that I do, less systematically than Holmes, more feeling my way around the shape of it in the dark. And what troubled me was not the complexity of it, but its atmosphere. There was a quality to this case that I had not quite put words to yet. Most of the cases Holmes took had, at their centre, a single hard fact, a theft, a death, a deception, around which everything else arranged itself. This one felt different. At its centre was not a fact, but a secret. And secrets, in my experience, have a way of damaging everyone they touch, regardless of guilt. I thought of Lady Cecilia's folded hands. I thought of Thomas Ashworth in Shropshire, living his life in cheerful ignorance of what his blood entitled him to and what it had already cost. I thought of Lord Ashford Mercer, in his 70s now, who had made one private act of feeling in his youth and had been paying for it in a currency he had not chosen for more than a decade. I thought of Hargrove, dead on his studio floor with his paint-stained hands extended, and I tried to feel the appropriate thing about it, and found that I could not quite manage it. He had been a blackmailer. He had used the vulnerabilities of frightened people as instruments of personal enrichment for 11 years, and yet he had also been, in his way, a careful man, careful enough to hide what he knew, to encode his messages in paint, to build in safeguards. He had not, I suspected, intended to die. He had intended to go on, as blackmailers generally do, indefinitely. Someone had disagreed. The Surrey countryside received us with the particular indifference of late autumn. Fields stripped to their brown essentials, hedgerows thinned, the sky a low and uniform grey that pressed down on the landscape like a lid. Holmes sat across from me in the carriage and looked out of the window and said almost nothing for the duration of the journey, which suited me well enough. There are companionships that do not require conversation, and ours had long since become one of them. He looked tired. Not the hollow, restless tiredness of the preceding weeks. This was the tiredness of a man who is working hard at something that matters, which is an entirely different condition, almost a kind of health. But I noticed it, the lines around his eyes, the slight heaviness in the set of his shoulders. Holmes burned through himself when a case had him, and the burning was not always kind. You should eat something when we get there, I said, as we pulled into the station. He looked at me with an expression that was halfway between irritation and affection. I had breakfast, Watson. You had coffee and half a slice of toast. That, he said, rising and reaching for his coat, is a breakfast. It was, I decided, not worth arguing. Some battles are lost before they begin. The village of Crayborn was small enough that a stranger asking after a London artist's country cottage attracted immediate and helpful attention from the postmaster, who knew of Hargrove, had received packages for him on 3 or 4 occasions over the past few years, and who directed us, with the thorough geographical enthusiasm of a man glad of something to explain, to a lane approximately a mile east of the village, where a stone cottage sat behind a low wall at the edge of a stand of old beeches. We walked. The lane was unpaved and soft with recent rain, and our boots were comprehensively ruined by the time the cottage came into view. It was a modest place, solid, old, the kind of building that has been standing long enough to have stopped trying to impress anyone. A wooden gate, a small garden gone thoroughly to seed for the season, shuttered windows on the ground floor, and the front door standing 3 inches open. Holmes stopped walking. I stopped beside him. We stood at the gate and looked at the open door and said nothing for a moment. "Someone got here first," I said. "Someone got here first," Holmes confirmed without particular surprise, as though this were a development he had considered and filed under probable. He pushed the gate open and walked up the path with a steadiness that I recognized as deliberate, the deliberate steadiness of a man who is not certain what he is walking toward and has decided that the uncertainty is not a reason to walk more slowly. I followed, and my hand found the familiar weight of the service revolver in my coat pocket, which I had had the foresight to bring, and Holmes had had the foresight not to comment on. The door swung open at a touch. Inside, the cottage had been taken apart with the focused violence of a thorough search. Every drawer in the small writing desk had been pulled out and upended. The bookshelf had been swept clear, the books lying in a splayed and disordered pile on the flagstone floor. A wooden storage chest in the corner stood open and empty. Its contents, blankets, folded canvases, are painting supplies, scattered across the room with the carelessness of someone who was looking for one specific thing and had no interest in anything else. In the small kitchen beyond, the same. Cupboard doors open, crockery moved, a flour jar tipped on its side with its contents spread across the shelf in a white drift. They had been thorough. They had also been quick, which meant they had not been certain they had time. Holmes moved through the wreckage in silence, stepping over the scattered books, pausing at the overturned desk, crouching to examine a mark on the flagstones near the door that I could not make out from where I stood. He was reading the room the way he had read Hargrove's studio, in that slow, total way, taking in everything, discarding nothing, letting the shape of what had happened arrange itself from the evidence of what remained. "They were here this morning," he said, without looking up. "The flour has not yet fully settled, and the grass on the path." He glanced toward the open door. 2 sets of prints coming in, 1 set going out. One of them waited outside. "A lookout," I said. "A lookout," he agreed. He rose and stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, looking at the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Then he was still. I waited. "Watson," he said at last, "what do you notice about this room?" I looked around it. Scattered books, upended furniture, the general wreckage of a thorough and hurried search. "It's been ransacked," I said. "What else?" I looked again, more carefully. The flagstone floor, the low ceiling with its old oak beams, the walls, bare plaster on 3 sides, and on the 4th, facing the garden, a section of old wooden panelling, dark with age, running from waist height to the ceiling. "The panelling," I said slowly. Holmes looked at me with the expression he wore when a student has surprised him favourably. "The panelling," he said. 3 walls of plain plaster, 1 wall of panelling. In a cottage of this age and this simplicity, that is either an aesthetic eccentricity or a practical decision." He crossed to the panelled wall and ran his hands along it, moving from right to left, pressing at intervals. Hargrove did not strike me as a man given to aesthetic eccentricities in his private spaces. His studio was a working room, arranged for function. I would expect his retreat to be the same. His hands moved steadily along the panels. Then they stopped. He pressed. There was a sound, not dramatic, not the theatrical click of a mechanism in a penny novel, but a small, dry, wooden sound, the sound of something that has not moved in some time being persuaded to move. And a section of the panelling, perhaps 2 feet wide, shifted inward by ½ an inch. Holmes worked his fingers into the gap and drew it open. Behind it was a shallow recess in the wall, perhaps 18 inches deep, 2 feet wide, lined with a sheet of oilcloth pinned carefully to the plaster to keep out the damp, and resting against the back of it, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth tied with a length of cord, a flat rectangular object of exactly the dimensions you would expect of a canvas approximately 2 feet by 18 inches. Holmes did not reach for it immediately. As he crouched and looked at it, at the way it was wrapped, at the cord. Still knotted, still intact, undisturbed. "They did not find it," I said. "They did not find it," Holmes said. There was no triumph in his voice, something quieter than that. The tone of a man who has come to the end of a long and difficult search and finds himself less elated than simply relieved. He lifted the package carefully from the recess, carried it to the cleared surface of the writing desk, and unwrapped it with the deliberate hands of a man who understands that what he is handling is, whatever else it may be, a work of art. The oilcloth fell away. The portrait looked back at us. He was a young man, 20, perhaps 21, as Lady Cecilia had said. Painted with Hargrove's full skill, none of the flattering softness he applied to his society commissions, none of the careful management of difficult features that made his reputation among the aristocracy. This was painted honestly. The young man was dark-haired, lean-faced, with a directness in his painted gaze that suggested someone who had grown up earning rather than inheriting his place in the world. And the resemblance. I had not seen the Mercer family portraits, but I did not need to. It was in the jaw, the particular angle of it, strong and slightly squared. It was in the brow, the way it sat, level and serious, over eyes that were a shade of grey that seemed very specific, very particular, very much the property of one bloodline and not another. It was in the set of the mouth and the shape of the ears and something less definable than any of these individual features. Something in the overall arrangement of the face that said, with quiet and irrefutable certainty, that this young man in his Shropshire life had no idea who he was. Holmes looked at the portrait for a long time. Then he wrapped it carefully back in its oilcloth, tucked it under his arm and turned toward the door. "We go back to London," he said. His voice was very quiet. Outside, the beeches moved in the cold wind, and the grey sky pressed down on the Surrey fields, and somewhere in the city we had left that morning, the man who had killed Edmund Hargrove was waiting, not knowing that what he had come here to find was already in our hands. "Tonight," Holmes said, "we end this." The killer in the drawing room. We were back in London by 6. Holmes sent a telegram from Waterloo Station before we had even collected our bags from the carriage. A brief message, the contents of which he did not share with me, dispatched with the focused efficiency of a man executing the final stage of a plan he has been constructing in his head for the better part of 2 days. He sent a second telegram from the cab. Then he sat back against the seat with the oilcloth package on his knee and his eyes on the darkening street, and did not speak for the remainder of the journey to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson had left supper. Holmes ignored it. He set the portrait carefully against the wall beside his desk, removed his coat, and stood at the window for a long moment with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the street below with an expression that I had learned over many years to read as the final assembly of something, the last pieces of a construction being fitted into place, checked, confirmed. "Sit down. Watson," he said, without turning from the window. "I'm going to tell you what I believe happened, and I want you to tell me if there is anything I have missed." I sat. He remained at the window, speaking to the glass and the street beyond it, his voice even and unhurried. "Edmund Hargrove," he began, "was a blackmailer of long practice and considerable sophistication. For 11 years he extracted payment from the Mercer family in exchange for his silence regarding Lord Ashford Mercer's illegitimate son, Thomas Ashworth of Shropshire, and his possession of 2 pieces of evidence, a letter in Lord Mercer's own hand and the portrait we recovered this afternoon. He was careful. He kept his evidence separate from himself. The portrait hidden in Surrey, the letter almost certainly elsewhere, in the keeping of a solicitor or a bank, to be released upon his death if certain conditions were not met. He had constructed, in other words, a system, a machine for the production of money from fear, and it had run smoothly for 11 years. He paused. Outside, a cab clattered past on the wet stones. What changed, Holmes continued, was not Hargrove's appetite, which was presumably constant, but the stakes. Lord Mercer is in his 70s. He is not a well man. The social notices of the past year contain 2 references to his withdrawal from public engagements on grounds of health. When Lord Mercer dies, the question of the Mercer inheritance becomes immediately and urgently relevant. The Mercer estate is considerable. The Wiltshire property alone is valued at something in the region of £200,000, and there are investments beyond that. Under normal circumstances, the estate passes to Viscount Hadley Mercer, the eldest legitimate son. But if Thomas Ashworth's existence and parentage were to be established legally, and Hargrove's letter and portrait together would make a very strong beginning toward that establishment, the situation becomes considerably more complicated. He turned from the window. Dorian Mercer, he said, the younger son. Let us consider Dorian Mercer for a moment. Hadley Mercer, the elder brother, stands to inherit regardless. Even if Thomas Ashworth's claim were established, Hadley's position as the eldest legitimate heir would likely be upheld by any reasonable legal proceeding. But Dorian's position is entirely different. Dorian inherits only in the event of Hadley's death without issue. And even then, his inheritance depends entirely on the estate remaining intact and uncontested. If Thomas Ashworth's existence becomes public, if the scandal breaks, if the family is dragged through a legal proceeding, the reputational and financial damage to the Mercer name would be severe. Severe enough, perhaps, to make Dorian Mercer's comfortable future considerably less comfortable. He crossed to his desk and sat, leaning back in his chair with his hands pressed together, looking at the ceiling. Dorian Mercer, he continued, is 34 years old. He sits on 2 company boards, whose continued confidence in him depends entirely on his family name remaining what it appears to be. He is, by all accounts, a man who has arranged his entire existence around the expectation of a certain kind of future. He has debts, not ruinous ones, but significant, that he services against that expectation. He is not a man who can afford a scandal. He is, in the precise sense of the word, a man with everything to lose. And Hargrove told someone the portrait was about to change hands, I said, recalling what Lady Cecilia had told us. Hargrove made a mistake, Holmes said. After 11 years of managing the situation with considerable skill, he made the mistake that blackmailers almost always make eventually. He overreached. He found a buyer. Perhaps he needed money quickly. Perhaps he simply grew greedy. But he let it be known, in whatever circle such things are let known, that the portrait was available. And that information reached Dorian Mercer. Holmes paused. Once the portrait changed hands, and Dorian could no longer predict or manage who held it. Hargrove, for all his faults, was a known quantity, a man who could be paid, managed, kept in his place. An unknown buyer was a different and far more dangerous proposition. So, he decided to remove Hargrove entirely, I said. He decided to remove Hargrove and retrieve the portrait, Holmes said. Both. He went to the studio that night, I suspect under the pretense of a meeting, which is why Hargrove admitted him, and he killed Hargrove with a single blow from a heavy object, almost certainly one of the larger palette knives or a similar studio implement that has since been removed or concealed. Then he searched the studio for the portrait and the letter. He found neither. He left. Holmes looked at me. He does not know we have the portrait. He does not yet know that the investigation has led where it has led. He believes, I think, that he is still ahead of us. And tonight, I said. Holmes smiled. It was a thin smile, and there was nothing warm in it. Tonight, he said, we show him that he is not. The telegram Holmes had sent from Waterloo had gone to Inspector Lestrade. The one sent from the cab had gone to Mercer House in Eaton Square. A carefully worded note composed, Holmes told me afterward, to give Dorian Mercer the impression that Holmes wished to discuss the case in general terms, as a courtesy to the family, and had information that might be relevant to their interests. It was, in other words, an invitation constructed to be impossible to refuse without arousing the precise suspicions it was designed not to arouse. Dorian Mercer had replied within the hour, after he would receive us at 9 o'clock. Lestrade met us on the pavement outside Mercer House at 10 minutes to 9, his collar turned up against the evening cold, his expression arranging itself into the careful neutrality of a man who has been given instructions he does not fully understand, but has decided, on the basis of prior experience, to follow anyway. "You're certain?" he said to Holmes in an undertone. "I am certain," Holmes said. "You'll want me inside?" "I'll want you in the hall. Do not come in until I call for you, and do not, under any circumstances, come in before." Holmes looked at him steadily. "Can you manage that?" Lestrade gave him the look that he reserved for moments when he found Holmes insufferable and was simultaneously aware that Holmes was right. "I can manage it," he said. We went up the steps. And Mercer House was everything that the name and the family suggested. a large, well-proportioned townhouse of the previous century, maintained with the quiet, understated perfection that old money achieves when it has stopped trying to demonstrate itself and has simply become itself. The entrance hall was floored in black and white marble. The staircase was broad and unhurried. The portraits on the walls were the real thing, ancestors going back 2 centuries, the faces in them carrying, now that I was looking for it, certain recurring features that I would not have noticed the day before. A manservant led us to the drawing room on the first floor. Dorian Mercer was standing at the fireplace when we entered. He was a tall man, well-built, with the kind of looks that had clearly been considerable in his youth and had settled, and in his mid-30s, into something more defined and less forgiving, dark hair greying at the temples, a face that was composed and careful and carried, beneath its surface, a quality of tension that expressed itself in small ways. The slight set of the jaw, the deliberate placement of the hands, one on the mantelpiece and one at his side, a studied casualness that was the opposite of casual. His eyes went to me first, then to Holmes, then to the package under Holmes's arm, wrapped in its oilcloth, and something moved in those eyes, quickly, and then it was gone, controlled with the speed of a man who has been controlling his expressions for a very long time. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was smooth and well modulated and gave nothing away. "Dr. Watson, please sit down." "Thank you," Holmes said pleasantly and sat, in setting the oilcloth package on the low table beside his chair with a casualness that was entirely deliberate. "I appreciate you receiving us at short notice, Mr. Mercer. I hope I have not disrupted your evening." "Not at all," Dorian said, moving from the fireplace to the chair opposite. "You mentioned information relevant to our family's interests. Regarding the Hargrove business, I presume?" "Regarding the Hargrove business," Holmes confirmed. "A terrible affair. Did you know him well?" "Hargrove? Barely at all. My father sat for him some years ago. I may have met the man once or twice at social functions. No more than that." "I see," Holmes said. He said it in the particular way he had of saying things that meant the opposite of what they appeared to mean. Not catching Dorian out, not yet. Simply placing a small, precise weight on the scales. "It is curious, then, that your name appears, in oblique form to be sure, in his private ledger." A pause, very brief, very well managed. "A great many names appear in the ledgers of men like Hargrove. My father was a client. I imagine the family name appears in various capacities." "Of course," Holmes said agreeably. He leaned forward and, with the same unhurried casualness, began to unwrap the oilcloth package on the table between them. Dorian Mercer watched his hands. The oilcloth fell away. The portrait looked up from the table, the young man with the Mercer jaw and the Mercer eyes and the Mercer brow, painted with Hargrove's unflattering honesty, looking out of the canvas with the directness of someone who has no idea he is at the center of anything. The room was very quiet. Our Holmes watched Dorian Mercer's face. I watched it too, and what I saw there, in the 3 seconds before he reassembled himself, was not the confusion or polite curiosity of a man encountering something for the first time. It was recognition, immediate, involuntary, and absolute. He knew the face in that portrait. He had been looking for it. And he knew, in the same instant that the portrait was uncovered, that the man who had uncovered it knew everything. "An interesting painting," Dorian said. His voice was still smooth, still controlled. The control itself was now the most revealing thing about him. "Isn't it?" Holmes said. "Hargrove's work, of course. You can always tell by the treatment of the eyes. He had a particular technique, quite distinctive. And the subject," Holmes tilted his head, as though considering the portrait with aesthetic interest. "There is something very familiar about the face, don't you think? Something that puts me very much in mind of the portraits in this very house. The jawline particularly, and the eyes." Dorian said nothing. "Mr. Mercer," Holmes said, and his voice changed. Not dramatically, but the pleasantness went out of it entirely, replaced by something quiet and very direct. "I know that you went to Edmund Hargrove's studio on the night of his death. I know that you struck him from behind with a weighted instrument while he was turned away from you. Because Edmund Hargrove, whatever his many faults, was not a small man, and you would not have risked facing him directly. I know that you searched the studio afterward and did not find what you came for, because Hargrove had hidden it where you did not think to look. And I know why you killed him. All of it. The letter, the portrait, Thomas Ashworth of Shropshire. All of it." The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence that had preceded it. It had weight. It had direction. Dorian Mercer sat very still. Then, with a movement that was so sudden and so fast that I was barely on my feet before it was already happening, he was out of his chair and across the room, not toward the door, toward the portrait, his hand reaching for it with the desperate, unthinking instinct of a man who has one remaining goal and has abandoned everything else in service of it. He did not reach it. If I had crossed the room faster than I had moved in several years, and perhaps faster than was strictly good for a man of my age and former injury, and I had his arm, his reaching arm, the one extended toward the table, and I had it firmly, and I am an army man and I know how to hold what I have taken hold of, and I held it. Holmes had risen and stepped between Dorian and the portrait, with a calm that was either admirable or infuriating depending on how one looked at it. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," Holmes said. He did not shout it. He said it in a voice that was entirely level and entirely final, the voice of a man who has arrived at the end of something and knows it, and is simply waiting for the other party to understand the same. Dorian Mercer went still in my grip. The fight went out of him, not gradually but all at once. The way a structure collapses when the weight-bearing load finally gives. He was breathing hard. His face, which had been so composed for so long, was no longer composed at all. What was underneath the composition was not what I had expected. It was not rage or defiance. It was exhaustion. The bone-deep, long-accumulated exhaustion of a man who has been afraid for a very long time, and has just run out of the resources to keep being afraid. I released his arm. He did not move. From the hallway, at Holmes's call, Lestrade came in. The arrest was made without drama. Dorian Mercer did not resist, did not speak, did not look again at the portrait on the table as Lestrade's man led him toward the door. He looked, at the last, only at Holmes, a long, unreadable look that contained, I thought, something that was almost beyond resentment, as something that was closer to a terrible recognition, the recognition of a man who understands too late that there was never any version of this that ended differently. Then he was gone, and the drawing room was very quiet, and the portrait of Thomas Ashworth looked up from the table at the firelit ceiling of the house that was, by any honest accounting, partly his. Holmes stood at the window, looking out at Eaton Square. He had not moved since Lestrade left. His hands were in his pockets. His shoulders, from where I stood, carried the particular set of a man who has done what he came to do, and feels, now that it is done, not triumph, but something closer to a profound and complicated tiredness. I stood beside him. We looked out at the square together, the gaslit pavement, the bare trees, the fog beginning to gather again at the far end of the road. "Well," I said after a while. "Yes," Holmes said, "quite. It was, between us, sufficient." The veil lifted. 3 days passed before Holmes spoke of the case again. This was not unusual. There is a pattern to the aftermath of his investigations that I have observed often enough to recognize, though I have never quite got used to it. In the immediate hours following a resolution, the arrest made, the pieces in their final positions, the mechanism of the thing fully exposed and understood, Holmes goes quiet in a way that is different from all his other kinds of quiet. It is not the restless, hollow quiet of the weeks without a case. It is not the focused, interior quiet of active thought. It is something else entirely. A settling. As though the considerable machinery of his mind, having run at full capacity for an extended period, requires time to return to its ordinary speed without damage to itself. He slept those 3 days, more than I'd seen him sleep in weeks. He ate with something approaching regularity. He played the violin in the evenings, not the fierce testing improvisations he favoured when agitated, but something slower and more considered, long melodic lines that moved through the Baker Street sitting room like smoke and asked nothing of the listener except to be present while they passed. I wrote my notes. I ordered my account of the case into something approaching coherent sequence, which took longer than it might have done because the case had not moved in a coherent sequence. It had moved the way cases always move in practice, which is sideways and backwards and in sudden lurching leaps forward that leave no time to record them accurately in the moment. I did my best. I always do my best. Whether it is good enough is a question I have long since made my peace with not being able to answer. On the morning of the fourth day, Holmes came down to breakfast at a reasonable hour, sat across from me at the table, accepted the coffee Mrs. Hudson poured with something that was nearly grace, and said, without preamble, "The letter has been recovered." I looked up from my eggs. "Lestrade?" Lestrade's men found it where I suggested they look, in the keeping of a solicitor in Gray's Inn, held under a sealed instruction that it be delivered to the Times newspaper in the event of Hargrove's death, unless the instruction was countermanded within 30 days by a specific written code. Holmes wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Hargrove had constructed his safeguard carefully. He was not, whatever else one might say of him, a careless man. And the code, to countermand the instruction, was known only to Hargrove, Holmes said, which means the letter would have been published in due course, regardless of what Dorian Mercer had or had not managed to retrieve from the studio. He killed a man for nothing. The secret he killed to protect was already beyond his reach before Hargrove hit the floor. I considered this for a moment. It had the particular bleakness of a great many things that are also, in some technical sense, ironic. Does the family know? They know, Holmes said. Lestrade informed Lord Mercer's solicitor yesterday morning. The old man himself is unwell. He has been confined to bed since the news of Dorian's arrest, which I imagine has not assisted his recovery. He was quiet for a moment. I do not think he will last the winter. The room was quiet. Outside, Baker Street was beginning its morning. The particular rhythm of it, the cart horses and the footsteps and the distant cry of a vendor, all the ordinary sound of a city that does not pause for private griefs. "And Thomas Ashworth?" I asked. Holmes set down his cup. "That," he said carefully, "is a more delicate matter, and one that I have given considerable thought to over the past 3 days." He had, in fact, done more than think about it. I learned this gradually, over the course of that morning's conversation, in the way that one often learns things from Holmes, not in a single organised disclosure, but in pieces, offered as they became relevant, assembled by the listener into a whole that Holmes himself has clearly possessed for some time. He had written to Thomas Ashworth, not as Sherlock Holmes, not in any official capacity. He had written as a private individual, a letter that was careful and considered, and had clearly cost him something in the writing, because Holmes does not find the management of other people's emotions a natural exercise, though he is more capable of it than he generally allows himself to appear. The letter had not told Ashworth everything. It had told him enough. It had told him that there were matters pertaining to his parentage that he had a right to know, if he chose to know them, and that there were people who could speak to him about those matters when and if he felt ready to be spoken to. The choice, Holmes had made clear, was entirely Ashworth's own. "You gave him the option to remain in ignorance," I said. "I gave him the option to choose," Holmes said, with a precision that mattered to him, which is what he has never had before, the decision about whether to know one's own history, whether to pull that particular thread and follow where it leads, seems to me to belong to the person whose history it is, and to no one else. He looked at his cup. What he does with the information is not my concern. My concern was that he should have it, and that the having of it should be his decision rather than the consequence of a court proceeding or a newspaper report. I thought of Thomas Ashworth in Shropshire, a man in his 30s, living a life he understood, with an identity that was solid and unquestioned and his own, and a letter arriving. How does one open such a letter? How does one read it? I tried to imagine it and found that I could not, quite. Some experiences are too singular for imagination to reach. "Has he replied?" I asked. "Not yet," Holmes said. "I do not expect a reply quickly. It is not the kind of letter one replies to quickly." He picked up his coffee again and looked at the window. The morning light was doing something reasonable with the Baker Street rooftops, a pale, wintry illumination that made the familiar view look briefly like a sketch of itself. "Lady Cecilia," I said. "Lady Cecilia is well," Holmes said, "or as well as a woman can be who has spent 11 years carrying a secret that was never hers to carry, and who is now required to carry it a little further while the legal proceedings run their course." He paused. "She is a remarkable woman. She will manage." "And Dorian?" "Dorian Mercer will stand trial in the spring. The evidence is substantial. Lestrade's men found the implement used to kill Hargrove in Dorian's private rooms in Eaton Square. wrapped in a cloth and pushed to the back of a wardrobe, which suggests that in the aftermath of the killing, he was not quite as composed as he wished to appear. The trial will not be long. Holmes's voice was even and without particular inflection. He did not, I noticed, say what Dorian Mercer deserved. He rarely did. He left that kind of pronouncement to others and confined himself to the facts, which is perhaps the wisest policy. That evening, the fog came in again. It had been doing this all autumn, retreating during the middle days of the week and returning at the weekends, as though it had somewhere else to be in the interim, and Baker Street was merely one of its regular engagements. Holmes sat in his armchair by the fire, which was properly lit and throwing a good warm light across the room. I sat opposite him, with my journal open on my knee, not quite writing, more holding the pen and looking at the fire, and letting the events of the past week arrange themselves in my mind with the slowness that proper arrangement requires. Holmes had his violin in his lap but was not playing it. He was simply holding it, his left hand loosely around the neck, the bow resting across the arm of the chair. He was looking at the fire too. The tiredness was still in his face, would probably be there for some days yet. But it was the right kind of tiredness now, the kind that comes from expenditure rather than vacancy. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He looked at me with an expression that meant, "You are going to ask it regardless, so yes." "The landscape painting," I said. "The one in the studio, under the veil. Hargrove hid faces in the clouds, used the whole thing as a message, a map almost, pointing us toward the Mercer connection. But he also painted it well, by any measure. There was genuine feeling in it." I paused, trying to articulate something that had been sitting at the edge of my thinking for several days. "Do you think he knew it was his last painting?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. The fog pressed at the window. "I think," he said slowly, "that Edmund Hargrove was a man who spent his professional life painting what other people wished to see, flattering likenesses, carefully managed truths, surfaces." He looked at the fire. "I think the landscape was the first thing he painted in a very long time, purely for himself. Because he was frightened, yes, and because he needed to leave a message. But also because, at the end, he painted what he actually saw, which was a desolate place, under a threatening sky, with something small and uncertain at the edge of the horizon." Holmes paused. Whether that was his view of his own life or his view of the world in general, I cannot say. Probably both. I thought about this for a while. "It is rather sad," I said. "A great deal of it is rather sad," Holmes agreed. "A young man in Shropshire who does not know who he is. An old man in Eaton Square who has been afraid for 30 years. A woman in Knightsbridge who has been carrying other people's secrets. A blackmailer who painted his one honest picture at the very end." He lifted the violin from his lap, settled it beneath his chin, drew the bow across the strings with the experimental lightness of a man testing the weather of his own mood. "And a younger son who decided that what he stood to lose was worth a man's life, which is the oldest and saddest calculation there is, and the one that turns out, almost invariably, to have been wrong." He began to play, something slow and old and without a name that I knew, one of the pieces he composed himself that existed nowhere except in the room where he happened to be playing them. The notes moved through the warm air of the sitting room with the particular quality of things that are beautiful and temporary and know it. I wrote in my journal. He played. The fire burned steadily. The fog sat against the window, and the gaslight from the street made it glow, very faintly, with a light that was neither day nor night but something in between. The particular London light that belongs to no hour and every hour. The light that the city makes when it breathes out at the end of a long day and simply rests. Outside, Baker Street went on about its business, as it always did, as it always would, indifferent to the cases that had been opened and closed in the rooms above it, indifferent to the secrets that had been uncovered, and the grief that had been rearranged if not resolved, but indifferent to the painting that now sat carefully wrapped in its new oilcloth in the corner of the room, waiting for a man in Shropshire to decide whether he wanted to look at his own face. Holmes played until the fire burned low. Then he set the violin aside and closed his eyes. I finished my notes, closed the journal, looked at my friend in his armchair, the angular face relaxed in something approaching peace, the long hands loose in his lap, the tiredness still present, but no longer the dominant thing. There are cases that close cleanly, with everything in its place and every question answered, and the world restored to the condition it was in before the wrong thing happened. This was not quite one of those. Thomas Ashworth was still in Shropshire with his uncertain letter. Lord Mercer was still in his sick room, carrying 30 years of a choice he had made in his youth and could not unmake. Lady Cecilia was still navigating the particular difficulty of being a woman who knows too much in a world that prefers its women to know very little. And yet something had been uncovered that had been covered for a very long time. Something had been brought into the light that had been kept beneath a velvet veil in the dark. Whether the light made it better or only more visible was a question I could not answer. Perhaps no one could. I looked at the fire for a while, then I looked at Holmes. "Same time tomorrow?" I said. He did not open his eyes, but the corner of his mouth moved, the faintest possible suggestion of a smile, there and then gone, like a match struck in a dark room. "Watson," he said, "there is no other time." I put out the lamp. The fire gave what light it could, and Baker Street outside went quietly on.